When we introduced JavaScript objects, we said there was more than one way to create an object in JavaScript. We've just seen one way of doing this, that is using JSON. In this example, example 16 in the source code that's attached to this video, we want to create an object using a constructor function. Constructors might seem familiar to those who come from Java and C++. However, constructors in JavaScript are different. So keep aside all your preconceived notions about what a constructor should look like. So we've just learned how to create an object the JSON way, where JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. This was basically a textual way of specifying what an object is, what properties it has, and what values those properties hold. The alternative is to use a special function called an object constructor. This looks like any other function, but it has some special elements about it. We'll see what they are in just a bit. So what is an object constructor? An object constructor is very different from a C++ or Java constructor. They may sound similar and they may seem similar but are subtly different, so please pay close attention. An object constructor is a function, just like any other function, and it takes in arguments. It's a function that creates objects, and all of those objects created using that function have exactly the same properties. You can specify different values, but it has the same properties. Like in the case of length, breadth, color, every object will have the same set of properties. An object constructor looks like any other function in JavaScript, but it's special in a few ways. We'll see exactly what those ways are which make an object constructor special and thus different from other functions in JavaScript. The very first thing that makes an object constructor different from any other function is that it magically knows what object it's creating. The object function knows that it's creating an object. It knows what object it's creating, and it can access that object within that function using a variable called this. This is a special keyword which is used to reference the object itself from within the object constructor. Object constructors are not called like other functions. They are called in a very specific way using the keyword new. You simply don't call the function name and specify the arguments. You have to explicitly use the keyword new so that the browser knows that this is an object construction and not simply a function call. Too much to take in? Let's take it slowly once again. An object constructor is different from a regular function because it magically knows what object it's creating. And it can reference that object which it's creating from within the function using a special keyword, this. This becomes important when you write an object constructor. When you write a function which is going to serve as an object constructor, you have to know that the this keyword used within that object constructor is valid and refers to the properties of that object, can be used to refer to the properties of that object that will be created. The second thing that sets an object constructor apart from regular functions is that it's not called how regular functions are normally called in JavaScript. It has to be called in a very specific way using the keyword new along with the function name. This is how you use an object constructor. Okay, that was a whole bunch of theory about object constructors. Now we have to actually see one in order to internalize and understand what we've just learned. To start off, let's look at how we write an object constructor. I'm sure you're all curious about it right now since we've spoken so much about it. This is an object constructor for a rectangle. Note that it starts with the function keyword. It's just like any other function. It takes in length, breadth, color, and then it assigns these values to some properties within itself. If you remember what we said about an object constructor, we said it looks like any other function, but it magically knows what object it is creating and can access it via a variable called this. What do these sentences mean in code? If you look at the signature of an object constructor, and by signature I mean the very first line which defines the function, you'll see that it looks like any other function. It's got the function keyword, it has the function name rectangle, and it has 3 arguments, length, breadth, and color, that's passed into this function. If you just looked at this line, you'd never know this is an object constructor. But it is. That means it is special in some ways. Let's take a look at how this is special. Look at the body of this function. There is a keyword this, which this function uses to refer to an object. This function magically knows that this is the keyword which can reference the object that it's going to create. And that's what this.length, this.breadth, and this.color is all about. The this keyword is used by this object constructor to initialize the properties of the object that it's creating. So this function creates a brand new object and uses the this keyword to access length, breadth, and color of the object that it's creating and initialize it to the values that is passed in as arguments to this object constructor. This.length refers to the length property of the new object this creates. This.breadth refers to the breadth property of the new object, and this.color refers to the color property of the new object. And each of these are initialized with the input arguments length, breadth, and color that's passed into this function. The constructor uses the this keyword to initialize the object. This is what makes the object constructor act like a blueprint from which a variety of objects can be created. This object constructor can be called over and over again with the new keyword, we'll see that in a bit, to create as many objects of the type rectangle that we want. As many objects with the properties length, breadth, and color as we want. We've described the object constructor in tedious detail, and we've even seen the code for how this object constructor looks. There's one thing to notice here though, that the this that we refer to within the constructor is not passed in as an argument, nor does the constructor explicitly return this. It's done completely implicitly. Let's parse this. Notice that the object constructor does not take in the this keyword as an argument. It just knows that this is valid and it can just use it magically. It does not return this as well. You simply use this function with the new keyword and it instantiates an object for you and assigns it to a variable, but this function does not explicitly return this. There is no return statement that you can see within this object constructor. The passing in of this or the return of this is magical. It's implicit. It doesn't need to be explicitly specified. The object constructor magically knows what this is. Now that we know how to write an object constructor, let's go ahead and see how we can use an object constructor to create as many objects as we want. That's what we're going to be focusing on next. This is how you use an object constructor. Var rectangle, that's the variable which will be assigned the object that's constructed, is equal to new rectangle and then you pass in a whole bunch of arguments. If you remember, we had spoken about an object constructor being called in a very specific way using the keyword new. Notice the keyword new before the call to the function rectangle. Rectangle was the function that we just defined, and we saw how an object constructor was defined in a special way. Here, the keyword new before rectangle basically indicates that rectangle is an object constructor. This new keyword is the only difference between calling a constructor as opposed to calling any other function in JavaScript. The presence of this new keyword before the function call is in fact the only way the JavaScript interpreter in your browser knows that this is an object constructor and it has to do something special with it. So do not leave off the new. In fact, when the JavaScript interpreter in your browser sees the keyword new, it knows that it has to do some very specific things. That new keyword is a sign to the JavaScript interpreter. The minute the JavaScript interpreter sees this new keyword, it will go ahead and create an empty object and pass it into the function, and all this is done secretly. You can't really see it happening, as the this object. So when it sees new, the JavaScript interpreter will secretly create an object and pass it into the function implicitly, which becomes the this object. This will be done in addition to all the other function arguments, length, breadth, and color. This will be passed in addition to length, breadth, and color. Too much to wrap your head around? Let's see this again slowly. The new keyword is a sign to the JavaScript interpreter. So whenever the JavaScript interpreter sees this keyword, it will create an empty object. An empty object is something which looks like this. So it creates an empty object which can be referenced by the this keyword, and it takes this empty object and passes it into the function that is the object constructor. So if you remember the object constructor that we saw earlier, the rectangle object constructor, this empty object denoted by the keyword this is secretly passed into this function that you see on screen. In fact, using the new keyword sets up the function to look something like what you see on screen. Notice the this object being passed into this function. Remember that this is not actually happening, it's implicit. The this object is passed into the rectangle function, assigned the length, breadth, and color property, and the rectangle function returns this. And notice the line below where rectangle is equal to rectangle and the this object is passed in. This is what is the logical equivalent of calling var rectangle is equal to new rectangle with those function arguments. These two are logically equivalent. It doesn't happen explicitly, it happens implicitly. New rectangle with the function arguments is the logical equivalent of creating an empty object this, passing it secretly in the function rectangle, assigning its properties, and then returning the this object from the function rectangle. Once again, because it's important, using the new rectangle keyword is the equivalent of passing this in to a simple rectangle function call. There is no new there, note that it's a simple function call, but we pass the this object in. Remember, one is logically equivalent to the other. The function rectangle takes in the this argument, that's the logical equivalent, and also returns the this object after assigning its properties. So when you say new rectangle, whole bunch of these things happen. The whole bunch of things which you saw with the this object is the logical equivalent of using the new keyword. So remember, when you write an object constructor, remember the magical role of this. This refers to the object that you're constructing using the constructor. And when you use an object constructor, remember the magical keyword new. New indicates to JavaScript interpreter that this is an object constructor and it secretly passes in a this object into the function that is the object constructor.